Many of the fine arts share critical guiding philosophies that students must master. For example, if you were studying the culinary arts, you would need to have a complete understanding of the basic cooking methods. If you were studying chess, you would need to be adept in the opening strategies that modern theory is based on. In composition pedagogy, we too have these guiding philosophies. Under proper tutelage, students will have left university thoroughly versed in figured bass, 4-part chorale writing, and the recipes that comprise the traditional musical forms. Advanced students will naturally begin to expand upon these principles, exploring tangents, making discoveries, and furthering the art. Beethoven was a prime example of this. His works are often classified according to the era he composed them in. If you were to hear a long, lost work of his, knowing only when he wrote it, you would still be able to make some educated guesses as to how it would sound. I've found that most of the other arts have an accompanying set of micro-concepts that remain valid when the main philosophies become irrelevant or obsolete. These micro-concepts are tidy little tools, small recipes aimed at solving specific problems, adding flavoring and conserving resources. They are much more practical than the central guiding philosophies and much less abstract. They can be used at any moment while composing any type of music. In painting, there are many of these miniature techniques. If you've taken an art course, you've probably learned about Da Vinci's sfumato technique. It's likely you've seen Bob Ross do something very similar, lightly dragging his dry brush across the tree line, slightly blurring the drying paint, creating fog. Monet would mix real sand atop his painted sand to give his beaches texture. Later, Pollock would add dirt atop his famous drip paintings to give them grit. The same concept, yet two drastically different periods in two dramatically different artists. The more I learn about painting, the less improvised it seems. Most masterworks have sketches or studies which were completed beforehand. Monet painted his famous lilies over 100 times. He wasn't only a master creator, he was a master technician, and it was the combination of his hard work and his generational talent that raised him to his current godlike status. In musical composition, we share many of these same principles, especially success via the combination of practice and talent. However, we seem to have far less of those handy prepackaged, ready-to-use tools. Dovetailing, pyramiding, planing, and stagger breathing are among the few that immediately come to mind. Dovetailing is when you seamlessly pass a musical idea from ensemble A to ensemble B by utilizing a small overlap. For a brief moment, both ensembles play the part, but the ear regards it as a continuous idea. It's used primarily to split difficult passages and to bypass range and breathing restrictions. Stravinsky dovetails on nearly every page of The Rite of Spring. Here is a small sampling. Planing is taking a fixed chordal shape and moving all the notes up or down equidistantly to the melody note. It can be done chromatically or diatonically. Look at the piano's right hand in this famous passage from Petrushka. This is diatonic planing. All the notes are from the C major scale, and the pianist simply holds their hand in a consistent shape while moving up and down the keyboard. Here, at the end of the first movement of the Piano Concerto in G, Ravel uses chromatic planing in both the orchestra and piano. Had he planed accordingly to the key signature, it would have sounded like this. Pyramiding is when all notes, or just the starting and ending notes of a line, are hit, then held by the ensemble. It creates an overlapping stack of rhythmic harmony. Listen to this downward pyramid that John Williams uses on the Jurassic Park soundtrack. Stagger breathing is a lazy man's tool. Instead of figuring out the dovetailing of rests yourself, you hand it off to the ensemble and they do it. Don't use this unless you are in the greatest of rushes. Figure it out properly whenever you can. During my studies of classical music, I've discovered a few more of these tools, though till now they've remained informal concepts in my head. I'll share some of them here with the hope that they will help you discover a few of your own. You may have noticed that Mozart's woodwind and brass ensembles vary, quite often, from major work to major work. His beloved Requiem Mass has no flutes or oboes in it. His Piano Concerto No. 26 has only one flute and no clarinets. His Divine Symphony No. 25 is the same ensemble, minus the flute, yet in the end it all sounds like Mozart. Mozart didn't seem overly concerned with keeping like colors with like. His woodwind voicings are mostly interlocking and formulaic. He would rely on his intellect to color his music and less on his orchestration choices. Puccini, on the other hand, was extremely diligent with his color choices. Aside from full ensemble tuttes where everyone plays, Puccini is incredibly picky about who gets to play with whom. Using like colors with like is hardly groundbreaking, yet what happens after Puccini exhausts his first best choices is fascinating. Let's look how creative he gets while problem-solving in this somewhat complicated example. I've always found these first few pages of Turandot to be mind-blowing. You would never guess listening to it, but he is insanely specific about his coverage assignments here. Let's focus on the low string whole notes providing harmony to the vocalist. Puccini starts by setting this triad pattern in typical fashion. 2 notes of the triad to the cellos and 1 to the violas. They are frequent partners and can provide harmony transparently. Generally, it is good orchestration to divide the bigger string instruments before the smaller ones. But that is no issue here, as only the top of the 3 notes is available on the viola. But look here, this upcoming B-flat harmony contains a root note below the cello's open C. How will he solve it? Well, he solves it by giving that bottom note of that triad to a single contrabass, masked 2 dynamic layers below the cellos and violas. A most clever solution and quite invisible if you don't listen for it. From his substantial masking efforts, we can assume Puccini was trying to be invisible here. Looking at the score, you can see the contrabasses are divided here. If there were the typical 8 players in the section during this recording session, 7 of them would have been dividing the pizzicato chord while the principal played the long note. It was probably his compositional intent all along to have this soft pizzicato 5th in the basses. The basso ends his phrase here and Puccini fills the gap with some new material. In fact, he uses this low pizzicato fill often in Turandot. Here it is in Act 3. So does that mean, according to Puccini's expert opinion, that 1 contrabass equals half a cello section? I think yes, mostly so in this specific context. Let's examine the low winds, who are also participants in this whole note texture. Well, yes, you can see that he prefers to keep their setting unaltered here. Since the bassoon does have the low B flat, he simply gives it to them, keeping his pattern tidy and concise. This supports our theory well so far. But look here. The bass clarinet that was also playing the root of the chord doesn't have that low B flat. So how will he resolve this? Well, in similar fashion to the cellos, he introduces the B flat on the available contrabassoon for 2 quick beats. The bass clarinet picks up the second note of the chord instead. Why only 2 beats, though? Admittedly perplexing. I am only guessing now, but perhaps his intent was to transparently subtract the troublesome bass clarinet from the texture here. Maybe it has something to do with the weight or attack of his solo contrabass blend and lend. I'm not quite sure. Either way, wouldn't you agree that this level of care for something so unexposed is significant here? This is very detailed arranging. Let's look at a much simpler tool that Puccini favors. The step or stay is a fancier and more flexible version of planing. Each participant gets 1 note, and they move stepwise, or in the smallest possible interval in either direction without overlapping each other. Minimal divisi can be used, but try to avoid it on the top notes. If no desirable note is available, or for taste, they can hold the previous note. Here is a beautiful example from Tosca. Listen to how perfect this harmonization is. I find this tool extremely elegant sounding. The super smooth voice leading and minimal divisi gives astonishing clarity to the harmony. Here is another example with some more cinematic flavoring, similar to what John Williams employs in The Book Thief. Outlining is temporarily using an instrument or section to contour a line being primarily covered by other players. It's used equally for color and technical necessity. This is one of the most refined musical tools, a level of detail only the masters concern themselves with. Look here at this clarinet and flute line from Tosca. Puccini underlines the first 2 notes of the line with the first violins. He colors them with a slide and a diminuendo. It's just a tiny, confident detail that shapes the line in a more interesting fashion than simply having the violins play the entirety of the line. It can also be used to give extra prominency to important melodic notes. Here, Stravinsky outlines the accented notes of horns 1 and 2 with horn 5. This gives extra virility to the accent while maintaining the fluid thickness that the 2 horns provide. It is significant to notice that in The Rite of Spring, Stravinsky set the horn ensemble size to 8 pieces, all of which were available and unoccupied for this passage. So seeing only 3 of the 8 used in such specific fashion demonstrates how conscious his effort was here. Earlier in this movement, he outlines the attack of this 4-note sustained chord, with the other 4 horns playing identical short notes. Outlining an accent is a very common and effective use of this tool. Listen how aggressively John Williams makes the attack of the choir by outlining them with the French horns. He obviously wanted only the choir color to sustain here, or he would have continued the horns for the whole line. It was a conscious effort. Sandwiching. A simple, satisfactory, and efficient recipe for presenting the melody in harmony. Sandwiching was a mainstay of Romantic string writing and is still useful to this day. Let's look at how it works. In this piano example, I have a melody in the right hand and some harmony in the left. I am going to take this piano passage and make a violin, viola, and cello sandwich out of it. First, violins and cellos become the bread, playing the melody in octaves. And the seconds and violas become the meat and veggies, getting the inside harmony notes. Here is how it sounds as is composed. And here it is sandwiched. Here it is notated on score. It almost doesn't matter what's going on inside the sandwich. They can be simple long notes, tremolos, or they can plane with the melody. It all seems to work satisfactorily. I first noticed Rachmaninoff sandwiching in this passage from the Second Symphony. I have used it several times, including this example from a piano concerto I recently recorded. It seems to work best in the strings, piano, and high winds. There are literally endless varieties of this. Easier to see than to hear, blurring adds a second dimension to a moving line by adding a non-moving line in its vicinity. The combination of moving and unmoving elements sometimes blurs things in a pleasurable way. In the famous opening to Rite of Spring, Part 2, the oboes are blurring the flutes and clarinets. John Williams blurs this famous fanfare from E.T. by having one of the horns hold the first note while all others play the tune. Many composers will use an orchestrational blur to emulate the sostenuto pedal of the piano. A very simple harmonic tool, you can literally look at your fingers on the piano and make guesses as to what will sound good. Take any 3-note chord and change 2 notes while keeping one the same. The moving notes can move in either direction by a half or whole step. Easily switch tonalities via this recipe. It is the main tool Howard Shore used on The Lord of the Rings. Its fancy classical name is the chromatic mediant. Let's turn this E minor triad to G sharp minor by expanding the top voice by a half step and contracting the middle voice a half step. Maybe G sharp sus next? The deceptive cadence isn't the only fake cadence. If you listen carefully, you will find yourself always being harmonically hoodwinked. Here are some simple examples of other fake cadences. The Impartial Resolution is one of my favorite tools. It is just so incredibly useful. This time, go ahead and resolve that progression to its proper tonic solution, but keep one of the tones unresolved. Make sure it isn't a chord tone of the resolution chord. Use that held note as a launching pad of a new phrase. Since the held note will be a non-chord tone, it will desire movement and be relatively easy to shape. Let's look at this example I composed. It reminds me a lot of what Williams does in his Star Wars scores. I am going to use the 1-2 tool as well. You've certainly heard over-harmonizing if you've listened to any bluegrass. Over-harmonization is when the harmony sits above the melody instead of below it. Here, the female vocalist provides harmony above the male's melody.
Where it's dark as a dungeon and damp as a dew, where the dangers are many, the pleasures are few.
This type of harmonization, while extremely common in rock and pop music, is rather rare in classical. Classical harmonies almost always exist beneath the melody and are handled by the lower chairs. 99 out of 100 times, chair 1 gets the melody and chair 2 harmonizes below. When over-harmony is implemented in the orchestra, the effect can be wonderful. It kind of softens the melody and equalizes the relationship between the two. Here is an example from Beethoven's 7th Symphony. Listen to the oboe, then the flute. I find it's quite hard to tell what the main wind melody line is once the flute comes in. They both sound as melody. It's a very pleasing effect. Here, John Williams uses over-harmonization while scoring the sick Triceratops in Jurassic Park. The viola melody weighs more lightly upon the ear, with the violins harmonizing above. It would be quite hard to improvise this setting on the piano without putting the melody on the top. Most composers would then immediately set the strings in that manner, with the first violins getting the tune and violas getting harmony. Williams's careful setting is much more colorful and tender. His choice is also very deliberate, as the entire melody could have fit within the first violin's range if he had chose to do so. Fader writing is a concept familiar to most of us. In the orchestra, you can do a version of this too. Simply give different players the same pitches and use written dynamics to fade between them. John Williams frequently does this with a single muted brass crescendoing underneath his strings. But my favorite example in all of literature is from Mahler's 6th Symphony. This can also be used internally in the same choir. Look how Bartók works the French horns here, creating a custom-built crescendo via 4 separate fader moves. The opposite of this works quite well too. It's sort of an acoustic fade-out. Thanks for watching. I hope we'll see you next time when we discuss captaining a session.